Russian President Vladimir Putin expects only one thing from his soldiers: unquestioning loyalty. It doesn't matter if he's ordering those soldiers into certain death. To Putin, dying for his desire to control Ukraine should be an honor that every one of his country's soldiers must feel proud to bear. And besides, those soldiers are being paid well, so why would they care about how much danger his strategic incompetence places them in? Well, they do care. A lot. And Putin has just found out how much, as intercepted calls have revealed that Putin is losing control over his own soldiers. They refuse to fight the war he started, and they're certainly not happy about being sent to die for his cause. The most recent rebellion among many that have occurred within the Russian army happened in the Donetsk sector that Russia has been trying to fully occupy ever since Putin launched his invasion. On November 26, the Kyiv Post published a report claiming that Ukraine's military intelligence, or HUR, had released the audio from an intercepted call, revealing that a unit of Russian soldiers had flat-out refused to carry out combat tasks assigned to them. The call doesn't feature the soldiers themselves outright saying no to their orders, but it doesn't need to. The audio that HUR released instead showcases the reaction of one of Russia's top military brass upon receiving the news that his forces had essentially thrown up a big middle finger to Putin and his demands that they engage in suicidal attacks on Ukraine's defenses. The commander who delivered the news told his superior that soldiers under his authority had abandoned their positions on the front and were withdrawing to the rear, which is a bad idea when serving in a military that acts as though every soldier on the front should be willing to die, if only to absorb Ukrainian ammunition. "Where the fuck are they going back? Where the fuck are they going? I'll fucking switch off their radios remotely right now. Goddamn fuck it. And they'll fucking march their asses back with full force," screams across the radio, showcasing just how much compassion Russia has for its soldiers. Not only are these withdrawing soldiers being treated as though they're weak for wanting to get away from the hellscape that Putin's war created, but their superiors immediately jump to the thought of punishment the moment bad news is received. The threat to turn off radios would make those withdrawing soldiers vulnerable by preventing them from contacting headquarters or each other, assuming they ended up being separated. And it gets worse. The Kyiv Post suggests that the tone of the conversation reveals that the withdrawing soldiers had failed to make any advances for several days. They would now be losing territory to Ukraine, assuming Ukraine's forces followed their withdrawal, and the superior who received the commander's call wasn't happy about it. And then, as deserters, forward, move. Yesterday they couldn't take a damn postcard, and now they can't even get through the damn tree line, the official rants. Yet another punishment threatened. Being labeled a deserter in the Russian military is no laughing matter. At best, you can hope to be caught by your own troops and shipped back home to stand trial. According to Sky News, desertion carries a maximum sentence of 15 years, meaning any soldiers who shirk their duty to Putin stand to lose a large portion of their lives in payment for their failure. That's assuming they escape with their lives at all. We mention this prison sentence as the best possible outcome for a captured deserter because the Russian military has meted out far worse punishments on the ground in Ukraine. CNN reported on several of those punishments in a July 28 article. It details one instance in which two soldiers labeled as deserters were both placed into a large pit and forced to fight to the death. One would essentially receive a brutal execution for their supposed crime, while the other might just survive long enough to be sent on a kamikaze assault that would likely claim their life shortly after. Another Russian soldier has been filmed tied to a tree as his superiors, or even his own comrades, decided to expose him to the elements with no protection for supposedly showing cowardice. That soldier was even taunted with the prospect of a Ukrainian drone finding and killing him before his former comrades abandoned him. It's unknown what became of that soldier. However, it's clear from HUR's intercepted radio call that any hint of Russian soldiers backing away from a fight, even if they're just withdrawing so that they can regroup, isn't taken lightly. Punishment always awaits if a Russian soldier isn't willing to sacrifice themselves on Putin's Ukraine war cross. So the call displays the brutality that is baked into the Russian military. However, it also showcases what that brutality has caused. Putin's soldiers are actively refusing to fight for him in some of the most active combat zones inside Ukraine because they know that they're not really being sent to fight. They're being deployed to die, in their droves, and the knowledge of that fact has created a morale crisis within the Russian army that Putin can no longer ignore. Conditions on the front lines aren't helping things, as the Kyiv Post reports. Recent intercepted calls revealed worsening conditions in the Russian military. One soldier complained of a lack of basic supplies, which led to troops dying on supply runs, while another admitted that various personnel, including cooks, were being used as infantry during frontal assaults, the outlet says. There have also been reports that some Russian soldiers are being forced to crowdfund to get their hands on basic equipment that isn't being provided by their own military. Another intercepted call, reported on by the Kyiv Post in September, revealed that some soldiers are receiving canned food and cigarettes but not any supplies that could help them fight. What does Putin expect these soldiers to do? Blind their enemies with cigarette smoke and throw empty food cans at them? Writing for Real Clear Politics, Andrew Moroz also discusses how Russian military morale has been depleted, and he suggests that Russia revealing itself for what it really is, at least in a military context, is partially to blame. Failing logistics, a meat grinder of a war that was never supposed to happen, and the crumbling of the illusion of Russian power are all playing their parts in the sorts of morale crises that are leading to Russian soldiers abandoning their posts. Ukraine's endurance has stripped away the myth of Russian might. The hollow Russian Empire cannot conquer what Ukraine has in abundance: moral clarity and unity of purpose, Moroz writes, and he may have a point. For his entire reign as Russian president, Putin has pumped the idea of Russia's superior military might into the heads of the soldiers that he is sending to the front. Russia is strong, everybody else is weak, and even though the Ukraine war has lasted for nearly 4 years, it's Russia doing all of the damage and making all of the gains. That sort of jingoistic propaganda may work inside Russia itself, or at least in the regions that are being sheltered from the news of Ukraine's many long-range attacks on Russian turf, but when a soldier enters Ukraine, they quickly learn that Russia's military might seem to be little more than cigarettes, cans of food, outdated weapons, and constant orders to march on and charge into crippling Ukrainian defenses. Is it any wonder that so many Russians are saying no to Putin's orders? On September 23rd, Novaya Gazeta covered a United Nations or UN report that suggests that more than 50,000 of Russia's soldiers have deserted their posts since Putin launched his invasion. Presented to the UN Human Rights Council in September, the report says that desertion has become one of the main avenues for those seeking to avoid participating in the war, and that the 50,000-plus recorded desertions represented nearly 10% of the troops that Putin has sent into Ukraine. That percentage may not be entirely accurate, as Ukraine's intelligence suggested in September that there are almost 700,000 Russian troops deployed in Ukraine, the Kyiv Independent reports. Still, over 50,000 desertions represents a substantial chunk of the soldiers that Putin is paying to die for his war, but instead choosing to lay down their arms and run away from their orders. Russia has managed to get its hands on about 16,000 of those who risked it all to run away, with 13,500 convictions for desertions being delivered in 2024 alone. Others who refuse to fight are often subjected to beatings, starvation, and death threats, the UN report claims. The harsh nature of the punishments we've discussed reveals how surprisingly brave those soldiers who refused orders have to be. HUR's intercepted call reveals that Russia's military officials leaped to these punishments without even asking why a soldier may have withdrawn, never mind deserting. So a Russian soldier knows that a heavy penalty, up to and including the loss of their life, awaits them if they're caught trying to do anything other than what Putin's orders tell them to do. Yet over 50,000 have disobeyed those orders anyway, and the number may even be higher than that. Recognizing that many of the people that Putin is sending into Ukraine to fight don't want to be there in the first place, Ukraine has created a hotline called I Want to Live. The service provides Russian soldiers with a means to apply for surrender to the Ukrainian army, with that surrender then being arranged clandestinely. It's unknown exactly how many Russian soldiers have managed to get out of following their orders using this hotline as of November 2025. However, we have figures from earlier in the war that give us an idea of how active this hotline has become. By January 2023, which was less than a year after Putin launched his full-scale invasion, The Guardian reported that 6,500 Russian soldiers had already applied to surrender via I Want to Live. Only a small number of those who apply are actually captured before they're killed, injured, or go missing in action. In June 2024, the Defense Post said that 300 Russian soldiers had successfully surrendered via the hotline. Presumably, many thousands more than the 6,500 who had applied a year and a half before had applied since, and there are likely many thousands more who have applied between the summer of 2024 and today. Thousands of Russia's soldiers are looking for a way out. The withdrawing Russian soldiers that raised the ire of the Russian officer in HUR's intercepted call are only the latest in a very long line. For several years, Putin was able to overcome this wellspring of discontent by offering fat paychecks to anybody who signed up for the military. The promise of more rubles than they'd ever seen before was enough to convince hundreds of thousands of Russians to sign their names on the dotted line, regardless of what awaited them in Ukraine. However, even that approach isn't working well for the Kremlin anymore. Whether it's due to the manpower crisis inside Russia or more potential recruits are growing wise to the horrors that await them in Ukraine, Russia has been turning its attention to signing up as many foreign soldiers as it can. And it's not getting these soldiers to sign contracts by telling them what they'll be doing in Ukraine. Russia's time-tested tactics of bribery and deception are being used to get more soldiers from other countries to fight in Putin's war. That's according to a November 25th CNN report, which points out that almost 200 soldiers from 37 countries other than Russia have been captured in Ukraine so far, and many of those prisoners tell similar tales about blackmail, lies, and bribes that the Kremlin used to get them into Ukraine in the first place. The situation has become bad enough that the Kenyan President William Ruto has expressed dismay over young Kenyans who have been illegally recruited to fight in the war. India is experiencing a similar problem. An Indian Foreign Ministry spokesperson named Randhir Jaiswal reveals that 44 Indian nationals are fighting for Russia. India has once again taken up the matter with the Russian authorities to have them released at the earliest and also put an end to this practice, Jaiswal said. South Africa, too, is looking into how Russia managed to convince 17 of the country's citizens to sign up to be soldiers in the war. Ukraine itself is no stranger to signing up foreign volunteers, CNN notes. However, the implication here is that Ukraine does so legitimately, whereas Russia signs up its volunteers via trickery. The Kremlin has made it easier for foreigners to gain Russian passports and visas in exchange for military service, and some are being told that they are heading to Russia for work, only to find themselves on the front lines in Ukraine, Walk Free claimed back in October 2024. Perhaps Putin believes that these foreign soldiers are less likely to refuse his orders than his own troops. Regardless, the deception involved in these hirings reveals the desperation that lies at the heart of the Kremlin. Ukraine has done far better defending itself against Putin's invasion than even the country's staunchest allies might have expected. To Putin, the sheer length of the Ukraine war has been a major shot to the gut, with each passing month making it harder for Russia to command the loyalty of its own soldiers. All of which brings us to the key question: why is Putin losing control over his troops? The brutality of Russia's officers and commanders aside, the obvious reason for so many Russian soldiers refusing to follow orders is that those soldiers know that they are more likely to die than not if they do. HUR's intercepted call comes from the Donetsk sector, which has been a verifiable bloodbath for Russia throughout the war. According to the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrskyi, 2024 alone saw Russia suffer 427,000 casualties. The vast majority of those casualties occurred in the very Donetsk sector that recently saw Russian soldiers refuse their orders, and Syrskyi's comments explain why they would have said no to Putin. Russia continues to carry out constant human wave assaults, suffering record losses. Last week, Russian forces have been losing around 1,700 people killed and wounded every day. That was just in 2024. In 2025, Putin has been focusing all of his efforts on the fortress city of Pokrovsk, and thousands more Russian soldiers have died because of that focus. In his trench art column, David Axe claims that Russia has lost 100,000 of its soldiers in the push for Pokrovsk between the start of 2025 and the beginning of October. Thousands more will have been lost since. It's not outside the realms of possibility that the last 2 years of fighting in Donetsk have resulted in over 500,000 casualties, marking the oblast out as a lethal proposition for any soldier deployed to it. Taking a wider view that covers the entire war, Russia blew past 1 million total casualties months ago. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that the total stands at almost 1.17 million as of November 26th, which is a scale of death that many Russian soldiers won't ever hear about. They'll see it firsthand, especially when they're ordered into one of the many suicidal charges that Putin seems to favor. The situation isn't any better in Luhansk. Though Russia is believed to control almost all of this region, which neighbors Donetsk, there is still plenty of fighting going. And another of HUR's intercepted calls reveals how deadly that fighting can be. On November 24th, the Kyiv Post published quotes from a call in which a Russian soldier labeled the Serebryansk forest as a place of certain death for anybody unfortunate to be sent there. That forest is located in Luhansk, and entire Russian units are being wiped out almost as soon as they enter. You walk into the forest and there's one corpse on top of another, the soldier says in the intercepted call. All the guys lying there have the same patch, that Vostok. There are just dozens of them lying around. Another Russian claims that one unit lost around 200 people assaulting the forest region, adding, 100% you'll be in a body bag there. While this death zone has been established in a different region from the one where the Russian soldiers we mentioned earlier have withdrawn, the context of this call reveals another reason why Russia's soldiers are refusing Putin's orders. In the case of the Serebryansk forest, they know that receiving orders to head in means that they're never coming out. The same goes for many parts of Donetsk, particularly near Pokrovsk, where Ukraine has amassed terrifying drone defenses. Russia's forces often face the choice between certain death if they advance or possible death, or perhaps getting off lightly with a jail sentence if they withdraw or desert. When put like that, it's obvious why so many choose the latter over the former. And that brings us to another reason why Russia's soldiers are refusing Putin's orders. They know that Putin doesn't care what happens to them. The callous nature of Russia's leader was known from the beginning of his invasion. Way back on February 27th, the Hindustan Times reported that Putin would be happy to allow his soldiers to die in Ukraine if it meant the success of his supposed special military operation. This was just days after the invasion began, with the outlet claiming that Russia was prepared to lose as many as 50,000 of its troops in the fight against Ukraine. That number seemed too big to be real back in 2022, but it's almost laughable almost 4 years later, when Russia's casualty count is more than 23 times larger. Still, the die was cast. Putin wanted Ukraine, and the mass death of Russian soldiers was a price he would be willing to pay. Fast forward to 2025, and Putin still doesn't seem to care about his soldiers. Remarking on Putin's claim that wherever a Russian sets his foot is Russia's territory, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha took to X to explain what that really means. But of all Putin's deranged statements today, one about the Russian soldier's foot stands out. In reality, wherever a Russian soldier sets his foot, he brings along only death, destruction, and devastation, Sybiha wrote before delivering a damning indictment of Putin's approach. Putin does not care about soldiers or their feet torn apart by Ukrainian drones. He is a mass murderer of his own people. He already disposed 1 million Russian soldiers in a senseless bloodbath in Ukraine without achieving a single strategic goal. 1 million soldiers, 2 million feet. That, perhaps better than anything else, sums up how little Putin cares about his soldiers. And as more of those soldiers are sent on one-way missions or told to follow orders that they know make no sense, they're starting to refuse to fight. Whatever happened in Donetsk is one of many incidents, and Putin may find that his control slips even further the longer his painful and brutal war continues. As his soldiers on the front lines refuse to follow orders, Putin is also having to deal with pro-Ukraine partisan groups on Russian territory. The Freedom of Russia Legion is laying waste to their own country's infrastructure, as Putin has been betrayed from within. This is a massive loss of control, and you can learn all about it in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering how Putin's invasion has backfired on him spectacularly. And thank you as always for watching.